What if I told you some movies we now call masterpieces were once considered too dangerous for younger audiences? The X rating did not always mean what people think it means today. Some were cut, some were attacked, and some almost disappeared. Yet decades later, these supposed troublemakers became cult classics, and a few became untouchable pieces of movie history. If you enjoy uncovering the strange side of classic cinema, hit like and subscribe to the channel, because Hollywood history becomes much more interesting when we open the doors studios wanted closed. Number 25. Island of Lost Souls, 1932. Long before modern horror discovered genetic experiments, this disturbing little nightmare was already asking, what happens when science stops having rules? Charles Laughton plays Dr. Moreau, a scientist conducting horrifying experiments on a remote island. When shipwreck survivor Edward Parker arrives, he slowly realizes that the strange inhabitants surrounding Moreau are not exactly what they appear to be. The deeper Parker goes into the island, the more terrifying Moreau's private kingdom becomes. One unforgettable moment comes when Moreau gathers his creations and forces them to repeat his laws. Instead of simple monster movie spectacle, the scene feels like watching a dictator controlling terrified subjects. British censors repeatedly rejected the picture, before eventually granting a cut version an X certificate in 1958. What once looked almost impossible to approve eventually became recognized as one of the most influential early horror films. Today, its strange makeup, jungle atmosphere, and Laughton's smiling cruelty give it exactly the unsettling quality that made cult audiences rediscover it. Number 24. La Ronde, 1950. Nothing about this film looks outrageous today, which proves just how dramatically censorship standards can change. Director Max Ophuls creates a chain of romantic encounters in which one character leads naturally into the story of another. Soldiers, servants, wealthy people, and working people move through the same emotional carousel, suggesting that attraction ignores the social walls society builds. The most memorable element is the mysterious master of ceremonies guiding viewers through the circular story. He appears almost like someone standing outside normal life, watching people repeatedly fall into desire, jealousy, and disappointment. That elegant structure helped make La Ronde internationally admired, but British authorities were far less comfortable with its relaxed attitude toward relationships outside marriage. It became one of the early films to receive the new X certificate in Britain. The delicious irony is that something once considered suitable only for older viewers later became tame enough to receive a PG classification. Its reputation survived because its sophistication never depended on shock. It depended on human behavior. If these first two surprised you, subscribe now because the movies get considerably more controversial from here. And tell us in the comments which supposedly dangerous classic you think looks surprisingly harmless today. Number 23. Blackboard Jungle, 1955. Before rebellious teenagers became standard Hollywood characters, a classroom full of angry students could apparently frighten censors. Glenn Ford plays Richard Daddier, a new teacher entering a troubled urban school where traditional authority means almost nothing. Instead of obedient students sitting quietly behind desks, he finds hostility, tension, and young men who believe the adults surrounding them have already failed them. The movie's most famous ingredient arrives immediately: Bill Haley and his Comets performing Rock Around the Clock. That opening helped turn rock and roll into something bigger than music. Suddenly, youth rebellion had its own soundtrack. As the teacher struggles to reach his students, confrontations become increasingly intense. One of the strongest moments comes when Daddier refuses to surrender control of his classroom, despite knowing how badly events could turn. British censors treated the film seriously enough to give it an X certificate after requiring changes. Decades later, its classroom rebellion feels like the ancestor of countless youth movies, proving that what frightened adults in 1955 eventually became part of mainstream pop culture. Number 22. Rebel Without a Cause, 1955. James Dean did not need a monster, gangster, or supernatural villain to cause panic. All he needed was teenage frustration. The story follows Jim Stark, a troubled young man whose family moves to Los Angeles, hoping for another fresh start. He meets Judy and Plato, two teenagers who are equally desperate for understanding, and together they form the strange substitute family their real homes cannot provide. Everyone remembers the red jacket, but the cliffside Chicky Run remains the sequence that defines the film. Two cars race toward the edge, while the drivers are supposed to jump out at the last second. What begins as teenage pride becomes tragedy. The planetarium scenes are equally important. Against images of an enormous universe, the characters suddenly seem tiny, lonely, and frightened. British authorities gave Rebel Without a Cause an X certificate with cuts. That sounds astonishing now because the film became one of the defining portraits of post-war adolescence. Dean's performance transformed Jim from a supposed juvenile troublemaker into an icon of misunderstood youth. Number 21. Beat Girl, 1960 London. Had not fully started swinging when this movie imagined respectable parents losing control of a new generation. Gillian Hills plays Jennifer, a wealthy teenager angry about her father's new marriage. Instead of accepting her comfortable life, she becomes fascinated with Soho clubs, beat music, and people her father considers completely unacceptable. Christopher Lee appears as Kenny King, a nightclub owner who brings a darker edge to Jennifer's rebellion. The movie constantly jumps between respectable homes and shadowy clubs, making the younger generation appear to be living in an entirely different world. Its most famous sequences are the nightclub scenes, where music, dancing, and youthful attitude collide with the nervous morality of early 1960s Britain. The BFFC required changes involving its adult references, risky behavior, and club material before awarding an X certificate. Yet what once looked scandalous now resembles an extraordinary time capsule. That is precisely why Beat Girl developed cult appeal. The movie accidentally preserved the moment Britain stood halfway between conservative post-war culture and the explosion that would define the decade. The early X certificate was not the equivalent of one narrow modern genre. In Britain, it began as a restriction preventing viewers under 16 from attending, and after 1970 the threshold became 18. Horror, social drama, political material, and controversial relationships could all receive the same letter. That makes these old classifications fascinating. They reveal less about what audiences fear today and more about what society feared then. A rebellious teenager, an unmarried couple, or a frightening psychological idea could be enough to push a respected movie into adults-only territory. Number 20. Room at the Top, 1959. The danger here was not monsters or violence. It was ambition mixed with relationships. Hollywood once preferred to hide behind closed doors. Lawrence Harvey plays Joe Lampton, a working-class man determined to climb Britain's social ladder. He becomes involved with wealthy Susan Brown while also beginning a much more complicated relationship with Alice Aisgill, an older married woman. Joe thinks he can control both romance and ambition. The tragedy is watching him slowly discover that human beings do not behave like pieces on a business board. One of the film's most painful sequences comes when Joe's emotional choices finally collide with the future he has been chasing. What appeared to be a clever path toward success leaves damage that money cannot repair. Its adult themes helped earn an X certificate in Britain, yet the film was hardly dismissed as cheap provocation. It became an internationally respected drama, and Simone Signoret won the Academy Award for Best Actress. What once required an X now feels like intelligent character drama. That reversal explains why censorship history can be stranger than the movies themselves. Number 19. Victim, 1961. Sometimes a movie becomes controversial simply because it says aloud what society has agreed not to discuss. Dirk Bogarde plays Melville Farr, a successful London barrister whose apparently perfect life begins collapsing when he becomes connected to a blackmail operation targeting gay men. At the time the story takes place, private relationships between men could still create devastating legal and social consequences in Britain. That gives every telephone call, photograph, and whispered accusation enormous weight. A particularly powerful moment comes when Farr finally stops protecting his reputation and decides that exposing the blackmailers matters more than preserving his carefully constructed public image. Rather than treating its characters as jokes or villains, the movie asks viewers to understand how unjust laws can make ordinary people easy targets. That was remarkably daring in 1961. The BFFC gave Victim an X certificate with a small cut, and the BFI notes that it was the first English-language feature to use the word homosexuality. Today, it is remembered as an important British social drama, and as proof that sometimes censorship controversy tells you exactly where society is about to change. Number 18. Psycho, 1960. It is difficult to imagine Psycho needing an adults-only certificate because its imagery has been copied so many times that audiences almost know the movie before watching it. But in 1960, Hitchcock was breaking rules almost immediately. Janet Leigh's Marion Crane steals money from her employer and flees, eventually stopping at the isolated Bates Motel. There she meets Norman Bates, a painfully polite young man dominated by the mysterious presence of his mother. Then comes the shower sequence. Hitchcock uses rapid editing, Bernard Herrmann's screaming strings, and carefully controlled images to make viewers believe they have seen far more than the camera actually shows. It changed horror filmmaking forever. Another unforgettable moment arrives later, when the truth about Norman and his mother is finally revealed inside the old Bates house. British censors required changes before allowing an X certificate, including reductions involving the shower sequence. Yet Psycho became one of Hitchcock's greatest successes. The movie that once pushed censorship boundaries now appears routinely on lists of the greatest films ever made. Number 17. The Killing of Sister George, 1968. Behind the title sits a surprisingly cruel story about television fame, private relationships, and the terror of becoming disposable. Beryl Reid plays June Buckridge, an actress famous for portraying the beloved Sister George on a television soap opera. Off-screen, June is nothing like her gentle character, and her personal life becomes increasingly unstable when she learns producers may remove Sister George from the program. That threat creates the movie's central irony. Millions may love the fictional character, but the woman playing her can be discarded the moment executives decide ratings matter more. The most memorable sequences occur when June realizes how little control she actually has. Her anger spills into both her professional and personal relationships. Its portrayal of a same-sex relationship caused enormous censorship controversy. The BPLAFC classified the film X in February 1969 after requiring a controversial scene to be removed, and some local authorities still refused screenings. What censors saw as dangerously provocative now looks like a fascinating examination of power, celebrity, and identity. Number 16. Greetings, 1968. Before Robert De Niro became associated with some of cinema's toughest characters, he appeared in a scrappy counterculture comedy that earned an X rating. Directed by a young Brian De Palma, the movie follows three New York men trying to navigate draft anxiety, conspiracy theories, romance, and the increasingly bizarre atmosphere surrounding the Vietnam era. Instead of telling one clean story, Greetings jumps between ideas. Its characters obsess over everything from the Kennedy assassination to avoiding military service. A memorable section follows De Niro's John Rubin, a filmmaker whose fascination with cameras becomes both funny and uncomfortable. De Palma plays with films inside the film, direct addresses and unusual visual tricks that hinted at techniques he would later develop much further. The MIPA awarded Greetings an X rating in 1968, and an appeal did not remove it. Today, the rating is almost less surprising than seeing De Niro before Mean Streets, Taxi Driver, and The Godfather Part 2 turned him into a legend. By the late 1960s, the meaning of X was already becoming complicated. The United States had introduced its new rating system in 1968, but the X category was not trademarked in the way later ratings would be. Serious dramas, political films, and exploitation pictures could therefore find themselves marketed under the same letter. That created a strange problem. An acclaimed filmmaker could receive the identical rating associated in the public imagination with far more extreme entertainment. Several directors consequently fought an X, not because they believed their movies were harmless, but because the label could restrict advertising and theater access. Midnight Cowboy would soon expose just how absurd that contradiction could become. Number 15. I Am Curious, Yellow, 1967. Few foreign films became American cultural battles quite like this Swedish experiment. At first, it appears to follow Lena, a young woman intensely curious about politics, relationships, and inequality. But director Vilgot Schumann refuses to keep fiction and reality comfortably separated. Actors suddenly discuss the movie they are making, interviews interrupt dramatic scenes, and political arguments appear beside personal ones. The result feels less like conventional storytelling and more like someone shaking a camera at 1960s society and demanding answers. One of its most memorable elements is Lena questioning ordinary people about class, politics, and social responsibility. These interviews make the movie feel like both drama and documentary. Its provocative adult material created enormous battles over whether the film could legally be shown in the United States. That controversy helped turn it into an event. Audiences were not merely buying tickets to watch a Swedish art film. They were participating in a national argument about censorship. That historical baggage is part of its cult reputation today. The movie itself can feel messy and deliberately frustrating, but that messiness captures the restless energy of the era better than a polished Hollywood production ever could. Number 14. Medium Cool, 1969. Sometimes history walks into a movie before the director can stop filming. Robert Forster plays John Casellas, a television cameraman who initially treats tragedy as material to be recorded. He photographs accidents, political unrest, and suffering while maintaining the emotional distance expected of someone whose job is to capture images. Then reality begins breaking through. Director Haskell Wexler filmed during the unrest surrounding the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, mixing fictional characters with actual events occurring around them. The famous climax places Casellas and Eileen, played by Verna Bloom, amid crowds, police, and chaos. Suddenly, the boundary between documentary and fiction almost disappears. That is what makes Medium Cool so unnerving. The characters seem trapped inside history, while history seems unaware that a movie is being made around it. The film received an X rating before release, something AFI records in its catalog. Instead of disappearing, however, it became essential viewing for filmmakers fascinated by the relationship between media and reality. Decades before everyone carried a camera in their pocket, Medium Cool was already asking a disturbingly modern question. When something terrible happens, are we witnesses or are we merely collecting images? Number 13. Last Summer, 1969. A beautiful summer location slowly becomes the setting for one of the bleakest coming-of-age stories of its generation. Three teenagers spend their days on Fire Island swimming, talking, flirting, and entertaining themselves. At first, their behavior feels like youthful freedom. Then they meet Rhoda, a shy and vulnerable girl played by Kathy Burns, and the group's casual cruelty begins becoming something much darker. The movie's genius is how gradually the mood changes. One memorable early sequence involves the teenagers rescuing an injured bird. What initially suggests compassion later feels painfully ironic, as the story exposes how easily empathy can disappear when peer pressure takes control. By the final section, youthful games have become genuinely disturbing. The MUPA initially gave Last Summer an X rating. Director Frank Perry later removed a small amount of material so the movie could receive an R and reach a wider audience. Kathy Burns earned an Academy Award nomination, yet the film itself became difficult to see for years. That scarcity strengthened its reputation. Viewers who finally discovered it found something more uncomfortable than a typical youth movie. A story about how seemingly ordinary people can participate in cruelty simply because nobody wants to be the first person to say stop. Number 12. Myra Breckinridge, 1970. Some movies become cult classics because everyone immediately recognizes their brilliance. Others achieve cult status because viewers cannot believe a major studio actually released them. Myra Breckinridge belongs firmly in the second category. Based on Gore Vidal's novel, it follows Myra, played by Raquel Welch, arriving at an acting academy, controlled by her uncle Buck Loner. From there, the film launches into a deliberately outrageous satire involving Hollywood mythology, gender politics, and the entertainment industry's obsession with image. Mae West appears in a major comeback role, immediately giving the production another layer of old Hollywood strangeness. Perhaps the movie's most famous trick is its use of clips from vintage Fox movies. Classic stars suddenly appear in the middle of modern scenes, turning Hollywood's own archive into part of the joke. Critics attacked the picture upon release, and the production itself became notorious. AFI material on Beyond the Valley of the Dolls notes that Myra Breckinridge was another X-rated Fox production released around the same time. Today, very few people would call it a perfect film. But perfection is not why cult audiences watch it. They watch because it is excessive, confusing, expensive, fearless, and completely unlike the careful studio entertainment surrounding it. It is the cinematic equivalent of opening a time capsule and discovering Hollywood having a nervous breakdown inside. Number 11. Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, 1970. Imagine a major Hollywood studio handing director Russ Meyer a famous title, hiring film critic Roger Ebert to write the screenplay, and then allowing them to create something that barely resembles ordinary studio filmmaking. That really happened. The story follows an all-female rock group traveling to Los Angeles in search of success. They enter a world of producers, parties, relationships, and fame, only to discover that Hollywood glamour can become surreal very quickly. Everything is deliberately exaggerated. Colors explode. Dialogue becomes theatrical. Characters behave as if they wandered in from several different movies at once. One of the picture's most famous creations is record producer Ronnie Z-Man Barzell, whose enormous parties provide the film with its wildest atmosphere. As the story becomes darker, its cheerful music business fantasy transforms into something closer to a nightmare. The Morbag gave the production an X rating, despite it being released by 20th Century Fox. Contemporary critics often treated it as ridiculous, but cult audiences eventually realized that ridiculousness was part of the design. Its reputation grew because the movie refuses normal taste. It is satire, musical fantasy, melodrama, and horror fighting for control of the same screen. And somehow, that chaos became its identity. At this stage in the countdown, notice what has happened to the X label. We have moved from serious British drama to psychological horror, experimental politics, counterculture comedy, and a major studio satire. There was never one single X-rated movie. The classification often became a battlefield between filmmakers, distributors, and censors, deciding what adult audiences should be allowed to see. That history also explains why modern viewers can watch some of these movies and genuinely wonder what all the panic was about. Standards changed. The film stayed the same. Number 10. Trash. 1970 Andy Warhol's name hangs over this movie, but director Paul Morrissey gives it a grimy personality entirely its own. Joe D'Alessandro plays Joe, a young man drifting through New York while surrounded by other outsiders living far from the glamorous version of Manhattan usually offered by Hollywood. There is barely a conventional heroic journey. Instead, the movie watches people survive from moment to moment, moving through apartments, arguments, and strange encounters. That loose structure is exactly the point. One of the most memorable performances comes from Holly Woodlawn as Holly, whose energy can completely take over a scene. Her long conversations and unpredictable reactions give the movie a strangely comic pulse despite its bleak environment. British censors had substantial problems with the material. The BFI's censorship archive documents Trash receiving an X classification, while the uncut version was not passed for home release in Britain until decades later. For mainstream audiences of 1970, it could look almost unfinished. For later independent filmmakers, that roughness became exciting. The apartments looked lived in. The people sounded spontaneous. The city felt dirty rather than glamorous. That accidental realism is why Trash survived the era that created it. Instead of becoming polished nostalgia, it still resembles something discovered in a forgotten New York apartment. Number 9. Raw Meat, also known as Deathline, 1972. Before underground tunnels became an easy horror movie setting, this British production turned the London Underground into somewhere viewers never wanted to be alone. The story begins when a government official disappears near Russell Square Station. Inspector Calhoun, played with enormous personality by Donald Pleasance, investigates and gradually discovers that something has been surviving beneath London for generations. What begins like a police mystery slowly becomes underground horror. The memorable image is not simply the creature itself. It is the abandoned subterranean world where it lives, decaying tunnels, forgotten rooms, and evidence of people cut off from normal society. Pleasance provides unexpected humor, which keeps the film from becoming relentlessly grim. The picture was released in Britain as Deathline before receiving the title Raw Meat for American audiences. AFI records that the Empire rated it X in 1973 before it was re-edited and given an R rating. That history perfectly suits the movie. It was too unpleasant for some audiences, too strange for others, and too British to resemble the American horror boom. But cult viewers eventually embraced exactly those qualities. Today, its influence can be felt in countless movies about forgotten communities living beneath modern cities. Beneath the trains and commuters, Deathline imagines an entire nightmare civilization that London simply forgot. Number 8. Sweet Sweetback's Bodice Song, 1971. Hollywood was not offering Melvin Van Peebles the movie he wanted to see, so he largely created it outside the studio system. Van Peebles plays Sweetback, a performer who becomes a fugitive after confronting police officers and then spends much of the story running through Los Angeles while authorities close in. The movie does not behave like a conventional action film. Editing becomes frantic, images repeat, Colors shift. Music from Earth, Wind, and Fire drives scenes forward. At times, the film feels more like political jazz than traditional storytelling. One of its defining sequences involves sweetback running, across streets, through industrial areas, and into open landscape. Escape becomes the entire structure of the movie. The rating story is especially complicated. AFI records that the film was screened by the Ratings Administration, and Van Peebles famously advertised it as being rated X by an all-white jury, although many reviews describe the theatrical label as self-imposed. Later documentation records an R rating. The controversy did not prevent success. Instead, the film became hugely influential and is frequently connected with the rise of the blaxploitation era. Whether viewers admire its politics or argue with them, Sweetback still feels confrontational. It did not politely request permission to enter American cinema. It kicked open its own door. Number 7. Straw Dogs, 1971. Sam Peckinpah took an apparently peaceful English village and turned it into a pressure cooker. Dustin Hoffman plays David Sumner, an American mathematician who moves with his wife Amy to rural Cornwall. David believes intelligence and politeness can protect him from confrontation, but tension with local men steadily increases. The countryside initially appears calm. That calm becomes increasingly deceptive. The most famous section is the extended siege at David's house. By that point, the mild academic has been pushed into defending the property while everything around him collapses into chaos. Peckinpah makes the transformation deliberately uncomfortable. David's ability to fight back does not suddenly make the situation heroic. It makes the audience question how much violence was waiting beneath his civilized personality. The film also became highly controversial because of an assault sequence involving Amy. Rather than describe it graphically, what matters historically is how heavily critics debated its presentation. AFI records that the original London running time was shortened for the United States in order to obtain an R instead of the original X rating. That controversy followed the movie for decades. Yet its cult reputation survived because beneath all the arguments sits a disturbing question. How civilized are people when the rules protecting civilization suddenly disappear? Number 6. Fritz the Cat. 1972 animation was supposed to mean family entertainment. Ralph Bakshi clearly did not receive that memo. Based on Robert Crumb's underground comic character, Fritz the Cat follows a rebellious feline wandering through a wildly exaggerated version of late 1960s American counterculture. Fritz moves between college life, political radicals, city streets, and increasingly chaotic situations, while the movie mocks almost everyone it encounters. Its most famous visual idea is simply seeing familiar cartoon animal imagery used for material audiences never expected from animation. Cats, pigs, and other creatures resemble characters from a children's cartoon, but their world is filled with adult politics, hypocrisy, and social satire. That contradiction created the shock. AFI records Fritz the Cat as an X-rated release, and film history sources regularly identify it as the first X-rated full-length animated feature. It also became a major financial success. More importantly, it proved that feature animation did not have to belong exclusively to children. Modern adult animation owes something to that broken barrier. The movie remains messy and intentionally offensive in places, but that is exactly why cult audiences continue discussing it. Bakshi was not trying to make animation respectable. He was trying to prove it could be dangerous. The remarkable thing is that X could hurt distribution and simultaneously become a marketing weapon. Horror distributors sometimes wanted the forbidden aura because it promised audiences something stronger than ordinary entertainment. Major studios, however, often feared the same label because newspapers and theater chains could refuse advertisements or bookings. That contradiction explains why filmmakers repeatedly edited movies down to an R, while independent producers sometimes placed the X front and center. The rating could function as both warning sign and neon sign, depending on who was selling the ticket. Number 5. Alien, 1979. Yes, Alien carried an X certificate in Britain. That fact alone shows why the historical meaning of X is so badly misunderstood today. Ridley Scott begins with 7 crew members waking aboard the commercial spaceship Nostromo. A mysterious transmission interrupts their journey home, and what appears to be a routine investigation leads them to an abandoned alien vessel. There, Kane discovers a chamber filled with strange eggs. Everyone knows what happens next, But the most famous scene comes later, during what appears to be an ordinary meal. The crew are relaxed, laughing, and finally believing their crisis may be ending. Then Kane suddenly collapses. What emerges from that moment became one of science fiction's most recognizable creatures. The power of the sequence comes from surprise. Scott gives audiences almost no time to prepare. The BFFC debated whether Alien might qualify for the lower AA certificate, but ultimately awarded it an X. The BFFI notes that the film's frightening imagery and biological horror were major factors. Today, nobody dismisses Alien as exploitation. It is regarded as a landmark combination of science fiction and horror. H.R. Giger's industrial creature design, Scott's shadowy spaceship, and Sigourney Weaver's Ripley became permanently embedded in popular culture. The X certificate did not bury it. If anything, it now serves as a wonderful reminder that one generation's forbidden movie can become the next generation's masterpiece. Number 4. Last Tango in Paris, 1972. Few films demonstrate the difference between critical prestige and public controversy more dramatically. Marlon Brando plays Paul, an American living in Paris after the death of his wife. Emotionally destroyed and almost disconnected from ordinary life, he begins a relationship with Jeanne, played by Maria Schneider, after they meet inside an empty apartment. The arrangement is supposed to exist outside normal identity. They initially avoid sharing ordinary details about themselves, creating a private world separated from everyday responsibility. But that illusion cannot survive. The more Paul brings his grief and anger into the relationship, the darker the story becomes. One of the film's strongest scenes has little to do with its notorious reputation. Paul stands beside his wife's body and unleashes a painful, bitter monologue. Brando appears less like a movie star than a man whose emotional defenses have collapsed. Another sequence became infamous because of an assault involving Jean. It remains deeply controversial and should be discussed critically rather than sensationally. British censors initially demanded changes before awarding an X certificate, and the film faced legal controversy in multiple countries. Yet Bernardo Bertolucci's drama remained part of serious film discussion. Its reputation today is complicated, and appropriately so. It can be studied for Brando's performance, cinematography, and exploration of grief, while also acknowledging uncomfortable questions about filmmaking ethics and Schneider's experience. Cult status does not always mean uncomplicated admiration. Sometimes it means a film remains impossible to stop arguing about. Number 3. The Devils, 1971. If a major studio released The Devils today, people would probably call it daring. In 1971, even the studio distributing it became nervous. Ken Russell transports viewers to 17th century France, where Oliver Reed plays Father Urbain Grandier, a charismatic priest whose influence becomes dangerous to political authorities. Meanwhile, Vanessa Redgrave's sister Jeanne develops an obsession with Grandier. When accusations of supernatural corruption spread through the town of Loudun, religious hysteria becomes a weapon. Grandier's enemies realize that fear can destroy him more effectively than any honest political argument. Visually, the movie is astonishing. Production designer Derek Jarman's white, geometric version of Loudun looks less like a dusty historical town and more like a giant modern institution. One famous sequence turns religious hysteria into chaotic spectacle, but Russell is not simply chasing shock. He is showing what happens when institutions exploit fear, repression, and public performance. The censorship battle became legendary. The BFFC requested multiple reductions, while Warner Brothers independently demanded additional changes. A cut version received an X certificate in Britain, and the American X situation led to even more editing for an R-rated version. For years, viewers argued over missing footage and preferred versions. That censorship history only strengthened the cult. Today, The Devils is not remembered merely because authorities found it offensive. It survives because beneath the spectacle is a brutally intelligent story about political power discovering that moral panic can be incredibly useful. Number 2. A Clockwork Orange. 1971 Stanley Kubrick did not simply make a controversial film. He made one that became controversial enough for him to withdraw it from British cinemas himself. Malcolm McDowell plays Alex, a young man living in a stylized near-future Britain. He loves classical music, speaks in strange slang, and leads a gang that spends nights creating chaos. Eventually, Alex is arrested. Instead of simply imprisoning him, The state selects him for an experimental behavioral treatment designed to make him physically unable to choose violence. And that is where the movie becomes more complicated. Kubrick is not asking whether Alex is good. He clearly is not. He is asking whether a government has the moral right to remove someone's ability to choose at all. The most famous sequence involves the Ludovico treatment. Alex is strapped into a chair while his eyes are held open and disturbing images play before him. Beethoven, the music he loves, becomes part of his punishment. It is frightening because the cure begins looking almost as disturbing as the behavior it claims to eliminate. Both AFI and the BFI document the film's X classification. Britain passed it uncut with the X certificate, but after intense press controversy and claims linking the movie to real incidents, Kubrick asked Warner Brothers to withdraw it from British release. It remained unavailable there until after his death in 1999. That absence made the movie legendary. People who could not legally see it heard stories about it. By the time it returned, A Clockwork Orange had become more than a film. It was a forbidden cultural object. And nothing creates a cult faster than telling people they cannot watch something. Number 1. Midnight Cowboy, 1969. Here is the movie that completely destroyed the idea that an X rating automatically meant a film had no place in respectable cinema. Jon Voight plays Joe Buck, a naive Texan who arrives in New York wearing cowboy clothes and expecting the city to make him successful. Instead, New York humiliates him. His money disappears. His confidence collapses. The glamorous life he imagined turns out to be cold, lonely, and indifferent. Then he meets Ratso Rizzo. Dustin Hoffman plays Ratso as a sick, desperate street survivor who initially cheats Joe before unexpectedly becoming his closest friend. Together, they form one of cinema's strangest and most heartbreaking partnerships. The movie's most famous comic moment happens when Ratso and Joe cross a busy Manhattan street and a taxi nearly hits Hoffman. Ratso slams his hand against the cab and angrily confronts the driver, creating a moment so natural it feels stolen directly from New York. But the sequence people remember emotionally comes near the ending. Joe and Ratso finally leave the city on a bus headed toward Florida. Joe abandons his cowboy image and begins imagining a normal future. Ratso, however, is becoming weaker. The dream arrives too late. Midnight Cowboy received an X rating despite being a serious studio drama. AFI records that the movie became the first X-rated film nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture, and then became the first to actually win it. It also won Oscars for directing and adapted screenplay. The film was later re-rated R without needing to become a different movie. That makes its victory almost impossible to repeat. An adults-only film walked into Hollywood's biggest ceremony and left carrying Best Picture. More than 50 years later, nobody remembers Midnight Cowboy because of the letter printed beside its title. They remember Joe and Ratso. They remember Everybody's Talkin'. They remember New York looking simultaneously enormous and unbelievably lonely. And that is why it belongs at number 1. The rating became history. The movie became immortal. So which of these movies shocked you most by receiving an X rating? Psycho, Alien, Rebel Without a Cause? Or the Best Picture winner Midnight Cowboy? Tell us in the comments. And if you enjoy discovering the strange stories hiding behind classic cinema, like this video, share it and subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes the movies once called dangerous are exactly the ones history refuses to forget.